So good morning. I'll echo Lisa's welcome to everyone joining us here in Boston. We've heard from Lisa and Bob Langer and Meg Terrell about the innovation hub that this city is. And I also want to point out, if you look out the windows in this direction at Boston's North End and see things like the steeple of the Old North Church and the statue of Paul Revere that sits beneath it, this is a revolutionary city as well. A home to thoughts about things that had never been imagined before. And that's what my panel is here to talk about this morning, a revolution that's occurring in the way we think about research, in the way we think about the development of new medical products, in the way we think about the value of medicines and the delivery of care that people need. So it's a great privilege to lead this group in that discussion, and I thought I'd just start with some framing contextual comments, because some of you don't think about this topic as much as maybe the six of us do, and particularly those who have been at the forefront of this revolution. If you look on your tables, there's a new publication that we've released here at this meeting, and we're going to use that as a backdrop and send it home with you as food for thought. If we think about the last 5 years, with 2012 really being a pivotal point in this new movement around patient-centricity, with 2012 being the passage of the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, when PCORI first began funding grants that required the investigators to meaningfully engage patients, and the funding of PCORNet as a system to accumulate real-world evidence that went outside the bounds of clinical trials. Those were really pivotal points. And for some of us who've been on the front lines of this work for even longer, myself a quarter of a century, actually, we know that there have been some different influences on what got us to this point in 2012 and in the years since, when the rate of adoption has really just escalated. Things like the societal change and expectations. And we need only to look at the coffee cups that we get when we walk into a Starbucks that are personalized as a symbol of, no longer is the institution and the paternalism of what kind of coffee I want you to drink. You're going to decide for yourselves. And if you were to walk into Starbucks and the barista would say, I'm just going to give you what the last guy got, that wouldn't fly, right? We haven't quite come that far in our healthcare system, but that's the model we're trying to replace. Technology has allowed us to do things that wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. We don't have to rely on a single individual's account of what it's like to live with a disease. We have the power of all kinds of networks, social and otherwise, to help us reach people, engage them, and get their perspectives, and then integrate those into the work that we do. We also have this idea that patient centricity and involving patients, there's an ethical reason to do that it has its own intrinsic value of what it brings to the system. And one thing that I've been hearing about a lot as we move from this aspiration to application is something called the emergent property of patient centricity. As we do it, it changes the way we think about the task of developing a medicine or delivering care. It shifts our perspective in terms of what the new reality is. And our Patients Leadership Council met yesterday, and I heard account after account of once you get people doing it, they want to do more of it. They want to do it better the next time. And that is a change in and of itself. It's hard to put a value on that, but it's certainly, I think, affecting all of the systems in which the six of us work. So we've embraced this concept of patient centricity. We've gotten our arms around it. And now it's time to get our hands digging into it and to figure out what the tactile points are. How do we do this? How do we organize ourselves and ideas and people around that task? And how do we make sure it returns a value, not just to the sponsoring organization, but the individual that we're asking to engage with us? And so I've asked my panel to be ready with some concrete examples about how that's happening in the systems in which they work. And we're going to start with Laura Saul, who's the Chief of Staff for the American Heart Association, and doing amazing work, not only in cardiovascular disease, but in all kinds of diseases that have a component that may affect the heart, the lungs, the whole body, and they've really been at the forefront of this. So Laura, please.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you that don't know a whole lot about the American Heart Association, we are the largest funder of cardiovascular research next to the NIH, and we have funded about $4 billion worth of research since the 60s, and we have about 2,000 active research grants that go on. In our research program, as you can imagine, we are very dedicated to inspiring careers for young investigators and really trying to build that pool and that pipeline as well. And throughout all of that, we work with our 16 scientific councils of 32,000 professional members, 5,000 peer reviewers, and a lot of patients. And through our commitment to research, the American Heart Association has always been really focused on what is going to make the biggest difference. And while many of these grants are investigator-initiated grants, we also, more recently, have tried to be more innovative in thinking about what our research priorities should be, where should our funds go, how should they be directed, and what outcomes, what real patient-improved outcomes and health outcomes can we gain by doing something different. We're also big fans of working with others and partnering, and Joe Selby, sitting a few chairs away. PCORI has been a tremendous partner to the American Heart Association, and we're so proud of the work we do. We're also very proud of some of the innovative pilots that we attempt to do. And so recently, we have been, we finished about 6 months ago, a pilot around crowdsourcing for research priorities. And we wanted to make sure that the community, so now when you think about the community, you have to think about both patients, providers, researchers, the whole spectrum of people that really you need to make up really quality research programs have to be involved. And so this idea of crowdsourcing, as well as, as Kim mentioned, with new social networks being played out, and with prize structures, we wanted to also experiment a little bit with prizes. Could we get better results? Could we get more results? Could we get better feedback? What would we get if we offered prizes to patients, to providers, to researchers to help us think about where are the biggest gaps in research, what should we be studying, and where our priorities should be? And so in this pilot, basically what happened is we divided it up into 2 phases. Throughout the pilot, please know we had an advisory committee that was made up of all of these different types of folks, patients to researchers to providers to practitioners, so that we could really get a true perspective of the right protocols and the right way to ask questions. But we had phase 1 was about asking patients, what is your biggest dilemmas? What are you most uncertain about? What are you struggling with decision-making wise? What was the most, quite honestly, horrifying experience you've had in the treatment that you are undergoing? And talk to us about that. So in phase 1, it was a month. Each phase was a month. We had 8,000 visitors to the website. Now, not all of them submitted ideas, but we had several hundred submit ideas, and then that was filtered down through another peer review kind of group for just, what were they looking for. And interestingly enough, we found that, it wasn't always about heart disease and stroke. It wasn't about a single condition. It was about, I'm struggling with multiple conditions. I'm struggling with multiple treatments. I'm struggling with how do you bring diseases together and their treatments and understand what that impact is. I have a brochure here on this, and I've got this off the website on that, but help me out. They also overwhelmingly talked about that quality of life was their number one reason for any decision they made. It wasn't about price, it was. They obviously cost and value and all of that played in, but their number one comment back to us was I'm more concerned about quality of life than anything else. And the one thing I really need are more resources and more tools about multiple conditions and treatments and how that impacts things. So for example, we had several patients with autoimmune conditions, lupus, arthritis, that wanted to know what happens for their risk of stroke. And interestingly enough, and Joe certainly jump in because you and your team have played such an integral part of this, but the patients really, stroke came up to be one of the biggest concerns across patient groups of anything. And so, I've had one already and I want to keep it from reoccurring, or I have these other conditions and I'm worried about some of the treatments may cause stroke. So that was phase 1. We came out with 7 principles or seven kind of guidelines for research projects. We took those then to phase 2. And in phase 2, we asked researchers and clinicians, how would you build a study that combined comparative effectiveness research that helped advance precision cardiovascular medicine? And it was great because for that one, we went out and we used all of our networks, we used all of our social media, we used a variety of contacts, and we had about 4,000 visitors to that site. We had several hundred ideas about the best way to ask the question, to put a study design together. And right now we are in the process of evaluating those for which ones we think we should fund these. We think we should go and find, whether we do it ourselves, whether we do it as partners, or whether we find others to join us. These are really important topics. They meet the criteria that we all wanted, but it's important that we got this tremendous amount of feedback that we have never gotten before in this way. As to what is important and what the priorities should be. Outcomes and learnings are, you cannot do this by yourself. Patients cannot do it on their own, and clinicians and researchers cannot do it on their own. It is the combination of their perspectives and their experiences and their knowledge that made the best, that made the best the best. We also learned that patients don't need any prizes. They could have cared less if they got, they're like, just put me in a drawing for something. We don't need any money. It is a privilege and an honor to be able to give you this feedback. Great, we did give them the money. We had 10 people that we actually pulled out of a hat, gave $1,000, I believe. Researchers and providers do like the prize. But that they too actually thanked us. We actually got several thank you notes and comments, not only from the peer review committees, but from the people that gave us feedback saying, this was tremendous because you allowed us to see something we don't see on a regular basis when we're putting together research projects. You allowed us to see the community and their response to what would be important to them and what would make a difference. So that is the example, and
we're going to come back to a lot of the themes that your example provided for us. So thank you, Laura. I'm going to make all of you switch your focus down to this end and ask Tanya Simoncelli from MIT in the Broad, who is executive director of a metastatic breast cancer project called Count Me In, to share an example from your work.
Sure. So Count Me In, I'm the executive director of Count Me In, which is an initiative at the Broad that's working to facilitate patient-partnered research in this academic research context. And we're all representing different parts of the R&D continuum on this panel. So. I was inspired to take this position and to work on this when I first heard about what is really our flagship initiative, which is the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, which is actually being led by Nick Wogley, who's a medical oncologist at Dana-Farber and also an associate member at the Broad. I was just really just so inspired when I heard about what Nick was doing to engage patients from the very start of this initiative and to do something that was very different from your traditional academic research model. So the project, it aims to speed discoveries in metastatic breast cancer through the creation of a very large database of clinical genomic, molecular, and patient-reported data. Patients are engaged directly rather than your traditional way of engaging patients institution by institution. They're engaged directly using social media and through partnerships with advocacy organizations. So when patients sign up for the MBC project, they come to a website, they click Count Me In, they register for the project by filling out a brief survey, reporting information about age of onset and when they were diagnosed, when their disease became metastatic, what medications they took, things of that nature. They're then sent an online consent, and they are asked to consent for permission to obtain their and analyze their medical records, their stored tumor tissue if it exists, as well as a saliva sample, and then they're sent a kit in the mail, and they send back a spit kit. So this project is still very much in the beginning. It was launched in October of 2015, but I think we've already seen just the extraordinary benefits, some of the extraordinary benefits of engaging patients from the very start of the project. So I'll just name three that I think have become very clear. First is just in the incredible pace of recruitment. So the project in just 20 months has registered more than 3,600 men and women with metastatic breast cancer. And that's a really large number because especially when you consider what is being asked of patients. More than 2,100 have so far consented. It's a rolling process, so we're still having consents come in. We have never advertised for this project. The engagement and enrollment has happened almost entirely word of mouth by word of mouth and literally like patient to patient and patients promoting the project on Facebook and Twitter and such and so forth. There's even an example of one patient with a large Twitter following who posted something about the project, and literally in like 2 days, 100 more people had signed up for the project. That could all be connected to that single Facebook or Twitter post. The second thing is that engaging patients has actually improved the study itself. So Nick and Corey Painter, who's the associate director of the project, they spent more than a year before they launched the project, literally going on a listening tour and just hearing and getting feedback from patients about the design of the study. Patients and dozens of patients and advocates actually contributed to things, everything from selecting the image on the website to refining the survey questions and helping to draft them, to actually giving feedback on the study design itself. And then thirdly, the patient-reported data has been incredibly valuable and rich and is leading to new research questions that are now being asked of the data, that by providing information on things like what medications people have taken, whether they've had extraordinary responses to therapies, what age that their age of onset, has allowed us to now identify subpopulations, subgroups of patients who've experienced extraordinary responses, people who have had who presented with advanced disease from the start, patients who were diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer at a very young age. These are all very interesting subpopulations that then can be further studied that would have been very, very difficult, if not impossible, to identify in any other way than through patients reporting the data directly. So it's just been an incredibly rich project in terms of really learning about the benefits of partnering directly with patients. And now our goal is to figure out how to replicate this and scale it in other disease areas. And so that's what we're doing.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
And very exciting in the context of thinking about the NIH's precision medicine initiative and what Count Me In can show to all of us, that program as it gets underway. So thanks.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch now over to Michael Gertler, who is the Global President at Pfizer for Rare Disease. And that, as we have seen over the last 5 years, has been a real leading edge. The rare disease community being more tightly connected, having maybe fewer individuals with with a particular diagnosis, better able to connect with one another once all these technology tools have facilitated that. And we're seeing that what's happening in rare disease is now transferring to the the more prevalent conditions like cardiovascular disease. So share with us the Pfizer perspective on how this work is going and what you're benefiting from this new era of engagement.
Well, thank you. Good morning, and thanks for having me. At Pfizer, we believe that, patient-centricity, providing better outcomes, more value for patients, has always been the motivation that makes people come to work ever since we opened doors in 1849, right? And as a company, we wouldn't have survived 170 years had we not done that. But we do believe we really need to take it to another level, that in the future, the companies that thrive are the companies that get better and better at providing patient value. And you can only get that by engaging with the patients to really, really understand that. And what that requires you to do in a very systematic way is to include patient engagement, patient centricity throughout the whole value chain, whether it's discovery very early on before you even have a candidate or a lead compound, right? Engage with the community, whether it's in development, recruitment, whether it's all the way up to sales and marketing and reimbursement. It has to impact how we research, it has to impact what we research, the portfolio decisions we make, the capital allocation decisions we make, all along the line. And you're right, at rare disease, we kind of feel we're at the tip of the spear of that. Because for us, the patients are not statistics, right? There are very few of them, we know them, we're very touched by the stories, we know the background, and we can personally see the impact we can have on a patient's life or the community's life. And that's incredibly motivating. So I want to give maybe one very practical example that we saw. We do trials we have an advanced compound in sickle cell disease. And if you look at sickle cell disease, the number of trials that either fail to ever fully recruit or are significantly late because of slow recruitment is absolutely staggering. And we wanted to find out, what is it really, why is it so slow and so hard to recruit in this disease? Because if we can do it better, we can get a treatment faster to the community. So what we did was we went out in the community and talked and engaged with the patients, not market research, not a one-way mirror in a focus group and you ask a set of questions, but really just going out there, going to churches, going to the community, and talking to people. And what we learned, which is, I guess, not a surprise for anybody who is in the field, but it's an incredible insight for us at the time, was you have to really understand the whole patient. It's not just the disease and how the blood cells sickle and how that works and the chemistry behind it. You have to understand the whole patient, the social environment, and the emotional journey the patient goes through. The social stigma with sickle cell disease is still enormously high. Patients don't get treated well at the hospital, so they stay home suffering and instead of going to the hospital to get treatment when you have an acute crisis, which would be the normal instinct to get help, this is almost the last thing they want to do because how they get treated. They present at the hospital, they get treated as or suspected drug-seeking addicts, they get triaged out, they're put in a corner, wait 3 hours here, let's see whether you still want the drug in 3 hours from now, right? So now imagine after that agony, the physical pain, the emotional pain, the waiting. Now an investigator comes with a 50-page brochure and says, would you like to participate in a clinical trial? You can imagine where that brochure ends up, right? So what we had to do is go out to the community and work with them and say, look, how can we do this better? Educate on it, which hospitals will treat you better? How can we, pre-consent patients if possible before they even present? And, we went out to mega churches in Atlanta, went out to the community, we're very engaged with them, and it has really paid dividends because we're recruiting right now at about twice the rate of what the historical benchmark is in the trial. So that's one concrete example of how patient engagement is not only the right thing to do, it also provides value.
Terrific. And Teresa Mullen, who is the Office of Strategic Initiatives Director at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I think she's got the most words in her job title. But in addition to the many other ways in which you've served the U.S. FDA, you have been really at the forefront of the patient-focused drug development initiative, and I had the benefit and opportunity to work with you on the first of those meetings for chronic fatigue syndrome. Right. And you've learned a tremendous amount. I remember the sickle cell meeting that you had as part of that series of 24, but you may have some other examples you'd like to share with us.
Well, yeah, and I don't get to Boston very often these days, so I don't know how many of you have been to these other meetings, but I can say for a minute, when Kim mentioned the FDA Science and Innovation Act of 2012, I was sure she was going to talk about the reauthorization of the prescription drug user fee. I can't believe you didn't mention it. It's Title I. All right, anyway,
It's the authorizing legislation for this, right?
But it's that really to me is very significant for FDA as well, and maybe for the Center for Drugs, which is where I'm from, and because we had been having meetings with patient groups and consumer groups in parallel with meeting and negotiating with our industry counterparts for that user fee reauthorization. And one of the things that emerged as critical to the patient groups, because we said, what do you want to see in the enhancement of the program? And they said they wanted to have more engagement of patients, they wanted to have a role. Now, they weren't clear, they told me later, they weren't clear what they meant by that. We weren't clear, but we put it in there. And we said, okay, we knew that we would benefit from having patient input in our benefit risk assessment. And we do that, of course, by drug and by disease area. And we have a framing for benefit risk assessment that begins with the clinical context, the severity of the condition, and the degree of unmet medical need. And those were the two broad questions that we focused on and what we committed to do. And again, Kim knows about it because we weren't sure exactly how we were going to do it. So it was very open-ended as we found our way through this to at least do 20 such meetings over the course of the 5 years. And we're on track to do 24. There are about 10 that are being held externally because it's been such a good opportunity and worked so well and been very effective for us and for patients that patients are now running their own meeting. They're doing it in the Washington area so that we're able to get there and they're able to have the meeting. And so we're able to accomplish this. But these meetings, they're focused and we work hard to have people come. And it's really an entirely different kind of meeting for FDA. And let me just say, we were very focused because we're seeing this as informing benefit risk assessment for drugs. So it's all to support decision making. It's not just engagement. It's not the usual thing we would do at FDA, which is one patient representative speaks for everyone, and they may not even have, they have to meet conflict of interest screening. They may not even have the disease. They have a patient's perspective. So this was very different. And we had discussions at least an hour long on each of these topics. The burden of the disease, what are the aspects of that disease that are most important to the patient, that are most bothersome and affect their life the most. And the second hour or so is on burden of treatment. So what are you doing now to treat yourself and how's that going? And usually there's a regimen of a number of things that they're doing, maybe some drugs, maybe there's a device in there, diet, meditation. They would tell us about everything and we would get to hear about how burdensome some treatments are, what a hassle it is to actually follow the dosing, to follow the dosing regimen. And if they're on multiple drugs, they spend their entire day trying to not eat, have this one 2 hours before I eat and this one an hour after. And you realize when we have our review, the heads of our review division are there to hear this and listen and ask questions. It's just eye-opening to have people directly telling you, and there's a room full of people, and they'll add on to each other's comments, and they'll say if that happened to them. And it's just been extremely powerful experiences. I mean, it's not uncommon for people, and the FDA people, and other people in the room to start crying in the middle of it because it's so devastatingly difficult for these people and their families to live with the disease. So this has been extremely effective in, first of all, a couple of learnings here. Patients are experts. In a world of experts, and certainly, we all, if you're in the, drug development or whatever ecosystem, you live with experts, right? And most companies will have their key opinion leaders come in, a small group of people, very influential in what they do. So everybody's all about experts. Well, what we realized is these patients are experts in what it's like to live with their condition. They're not the clinical expert, they're not the statistical expert, but they certainly know what it's like to live with the condition. They're very reliable, they have all the cognitive characteristics of expertise in an area where they're very concise and consistent in how they describe things. And this was across people who'd never met each other before in these rooms who would be hearing this. So that was a very powerful takeaway for us. Another thing we realized is that they're hardly ever engaged in the patient-reported outcome tool development. So most instruments that are developed to collect information from patients, which indeed they report on, did not involve patients in the development of those tools. And so guess what? They may miss completely the item that would have mattered to them or the description that would have been meaningful to them. So the words they would use to describe the impact on their life or the things that mattered were not in those instruments. So that was another really important takeaway. Another thing, and I think I remember Kim actually asking this in a very provocative way at one of the early meetings. She said, well, this is great. This was a very powerful meeting. I'm just paraphrasing, but you said something like this.
Okay.
You can contradict me if you didn't. She said, but what are you going to do now? What are you going to do? So that put us into this obsessive, like, oh my God, what are we going to do? These are great meetings, but at the end of the day, it's anecdote. Okay, it's powerful anecdote. We can use it, and it'll give us some insights, and we can maybe inform our weighing of benefit risk. There's always going to be a subjective component to how FDA makes decisions because we think there has to be at the end of the day. There's always residual uncertainty. But we wanted to say, well, these meetings are great, but that's not the end of the story. So how do we go? Because kind of like Tanya, we're all about better evidence. I think Bob Langer actually mentioned this too. We want the best evidence we can get for decision making. Good enough. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect, but as good as it can be. So how do we go from powerful anecdote to fit for purpose collection of this information in clinical trials so that we actually have it as part of the evidence base? It can be used as a basis for decision making. It could be put into labeling. And so that's really what led us to what we negotiated or with industry, very interested, and patients, everybody on the same page now. Fast forward to PDUFA 6 negotiation discussions. Everybody wanted to basically move from this, advancing from that to how do we incorporate this stuff and make it become data and so that we can use it as evidence. And probably the instrument could be used beyond approval and so forth, but if we focus on development phase. So there's a lot of ways to integrate this, but that's been one of our main areas of emphasis in the near term. 21st Century Cures, which was enacted in December of 2016, echoes these same objectives, and there are a set of guidances we've committed to do. We're having our first meeting on the first of these. So we're sort of going from that kind of meeting, that qualitative early research. I like the way Mike laid it out because that is the sort of, we think, start very early and certainly find out what people care about and what's going on with their current treatments to figure out where you want to go. But go from there and what methods we need people to use to try to collect a good representative cross-section of views, distill that down. Subsequent guidance will be about how to distill that into the things that are most meaningful to the patient, turn that into measurable endpoints that might actually move with a treatment. Some things would not necessarily be sensitive to treatment, and then get that incorporated into trials. So that's only one piece, but we see that as one that's very FDA, we want to bring this information and have it be a basis for our decision making, and we think that that'll raise the importance of it as well for others. And there's a lot of work that has to go into this, a lot of culture change that we see as necessary within FDA and probably within all the other organizations that we're working with where we all figure out how to do this very well. So I think that, I'd say to me, one of the returns on investment here is better evidence. And better evidence may mean also better enrollment in trials if you're, and there's a lot of components to it, but we think there's value, return on value very practically all along the continuum. So I'll stop there.
Well, great. And it's been really remarkable to watch the acquisition of a whole new set of skills in your team to be able to put these meetings on and to really foster an environment where patients feel so honored and trusted to share some things that they may not have shared with any other living being. I heard that many times.
I have a very
those meetings.
fantastic team of people.
Yeah, it's terrific. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. And now I'm going to switch over to my right here. And first I have to thank not all the panelists, but in particular Joe, who stepped in and sort of a last minute when we heard that Francis wasn't going to be able to join us. So thank you for rearranging your day to start it with us here in Boston. And in 2012 and 2010, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute was created as a part of the Affordable Care Act. And by 2012, you had a map of what kind of research you were going to do. You were starting to fund grants. You were putting PCORNet together. And that was really an exciting time for a lot of us to suddenly have something called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. to help lead the way for how we were going to do this together. So Joe Selby, tell us from the executive director role of that organization and your long career as a physician and clinical researcher. Give us an aha moment you've had.
Well, thanks, Kim. And I just want to say this panel has been fantastic. And a lot of things I'll say echo what's already been said. I'm happy to have had the opportunity to join it. Back to the name, I think it has to be said that we were very lucky to get the name the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. When I got to Washington, I said, how did it get this name? And nobody, not in Congress or anywhere else, could really tell me. But I would like to thank the silent patient or patient advocate or organization that persuaded the silent senator or congressman person to decide to call us PCORI instead of SERI. Can you imagine what we might be talking about today if we were the Comparative Effectiveness Research Institute? We may be sitting here arguing with each other. So echo Kim's comment that this is an emergent phenomenon. I'm just here to tell you that we've only scratched the surface, seen the tip of the iceberg. Patients having a foot in the door are going to make what we do in medical research very different going forward. They already are, and they will continue to. I want to say that when I got to town, the board was the board, and one of our board members, Harlan Krumholtz, is here in the audience, and I just tip my hat to Harlan and the other 20 members of the board for really wrestling the notion of what does patient-centered outcomes research mean to the ground. And they said, it has to be a set of research questions that actually matter to patients. It can't be just interesting. It actually has to address the dilemma that patients face. And for goodness sake, it must capture the outcomes that patients say are important. So that leads. They also told us very clearly, you must engage patients in order to find out what those questions and outcomes are, and do not stop at patients. You've got to get clinicians, you've got to get payers, you've got to get delivery systems, policymakers at the table too. So that's the way we've gone forward. Laura said that getting to exactly the right question isn't easy. No, it isn't. All of that crowdsourcing was extraordinarily exciting, and it pointed us to the big area of atrial fibrillation and stroke prevention. We are still working to get to the right question, the question that's not already being studied, the question that's irrelevant, the question that's already been answered. So it genuinely takes the whole village to get started and get to the question that will ultimately make a difference. And in the post-approval space with comparative effectiveness research, it is really the question that will make a difference, that will address the decisional dilemma. Two quick examples. We funded a study called Prosper. It was just one of our broad funding initiatives, and it was about a cohort research done in a cohort of patients with atrial fibrillation, coincidentally, and who had had a stroke. So this 13,000 person cohort had an advisory panel, and the researchers, Adrian Hernandez and others from Duke, sat down with the advisory panel and said, we want to study whether anticoagulation really still works in people who've already had a stroke. These people are elderly, they have multiple conditions, there's concerns that anticoagulation might interfere with other treatments, it might ruin their quality of life. So we're going to study this, and we're going to measure the outcome will be MACE, major adverse cardiovascular events, heart attack, stroke, or death from cardiovascular disease. Patients say, wait a minute, we are 82 years old on average. We know we're going to have more heart attacks. We know we're going to have more strokes. We know we're going to die. That might not even be the worst thing. What we're really worried about is how much time we're going to have to spend in the hospital. So change your study, change the analysis, change the outcomes. We want to know about time spent in the hospital during follow-up. So they did, and they studied whether anticoagulation made a difference in patients who were 82 years old and already had a stroke. And it turned out that taking anticoagulants was associated with 7 fewer weeks of hospitalization over the next 2 years. Yes, it led to fewer heart attacks, fewer strokes, fewer cardiovascular deaths. Patients couldn't care less about that, but when they heard that 7 fewer weeks were spent in the hospital over a 2-year period, it made a difference. Easier to disseminate that. Second quick story, we were told by payers that multiple sclerosis was just a mess. There were 14 new drugs. They all cost an arm and a leg, and they had all been shown to be efficacious and all been FDA approved, of course. So we brought patients together with clinicians, the American Academy of Neurology, the National Multiple Sclerosis Foundation, the National Institute of NINDS, and others to the room. And patients really just spoke up in unison, and they said, we know that these drugs these disease-modifying drugs reduce the progression of plaques on MRIs, and they reduce the frequency of relapses and relapsing remitting. Our problems are that we have fatigue, that we can't sleep, that we have pain, that we have depression. We want to know the differences between these agents in terms of those. So we now have about a $40 million portfolio in research on multiple sclerosis, comparative effectiveness research. But guess what? The outcomes include pain, fatigue, depression, insomnia. So two stories about just how patient engagement changed what we funded. The last thing a couple people have alluded to this, and this is kind of a logical track that I can't get off of these days, and I think it might be one of the ways that research gets transformed going forward. If we have moved to the point where we're involving patients from very early on, as Michael said, if we have designed the study so that it addresses a question that's of interest to them, if patients have then said, yes, I will participate, well, they have, number one, a lot of skin in the game, and their biggest risk is that the study will not accrue, and that their time and effort, any risks that they subjected themselves to, will be wasted. So historically, there has been a real tendency to not approve the involvement of patients directly in recruitment. That has been seen as a form of coercion, either of the participants already in or of the people you'd be reaching out to. But I think we've got to have dialogues with, and I was really heartened to hear about Tanya's study and also Michael's. I think we are beginning to see perhaps that in some places IRBs are seeing this logic, that if patients have said this is the study that needs to be done and I'm going to participate in it, I want to get it recruited up, and it takes a large size to really get at patient-centered answers. We need to see IRBs beginning to realize that patients have a vested interest in seeing that recruitment goes well. So that's just a thought to put on the table about how patient-centricity may well play into better, faster trials.
We need a panel titled Patient-centricity, Payers, and IRBs, the Last Frontier, right?
You said it much better than I.
Something that you said, Joe, about the outcomes that were of interest to the MS patients, cognition, fatigue, pain, we certainly heard those three symptoms across almost all of the patient-focused drug development meetings, and those are symptoms for which we have poor measures at this point. And we're talking about measuring what matters, and we've got to get better at that.
Yeah, and I think what we've learned too is that fatigue actually can mean different things, and pain. So we actually have to look into the disease specific to see which measures that may already exist can fit for them, or if we have to come up with something slightly different so that they respond to this. But absolutely, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word revolutionary before, and if we somehow develop a science of clinical research that crosses conditions and addresses broad categories of symptoms, that will be revolutionary. But I, like Teresa, and Pecori, like Teresa, has not actually found a real easy path to this across diseases yet. We're studying fatigue, but we tend to study it in illnesses like multiple sclerosis now. But as Laura pointed out, the incredible concentration of conditions and symptoms in people. So that's it. That's potential frontier as well.
I'm going to switch it up a minute. We've got a visual that our graphics department worked hours on. So if you guys could give me number 4, I'm going to ask a question of the audience here. So in this patient-centricity, you can think of movements as being the Sisyphus portion where we're pushing the rock up the hill, Or the snowball effect where we're chasing it down the other side. How many of you think this patient centricity is still in the Sisyphus stage of the game? If I could see a show of hands. And the panel is welcome to join in too. Yeah, I think, and how many feel like we're chasing it down the other side? Hard to keep up with. We don't know where it's going to land at the bottom of the hill. So we're all on the Sisyphus
All been
side.
converted.
Yeah.
I do have a comment on that, though. I think we have to be careful once we get to the snowball effect, and maybe partially, we're already there, because it gets very fashionable for pharmaceutical companies to reach out to community and let's come in, let's have a patient present at the meeting, we all cry, but it's also an incredible burden on the patient community because they have so many companies to work with. So we really need to make sure that we don't just measure quantity, but we measure quality and how it really changes our behavior and what we do with, it's not 24 meetings, it's what do the 24 meetings actually produce.
That was a very nuanced answer. That was good. Because I think I don't agree with Mike that the people's, there's a lot of enthusiasm. The enthusiasm might be over the edge, but that's not going to work if we don't get the system and the instrumentation and all this, how we're going to operationalize it up further.
The hill.
We've got a lot to do there.
Yeah, absolutely. So several of the topic of this is what's the return on engagement? And several of the other conversations that many of us participate in about this, all right, how do we know what we're doing? How do we know whether what we're doing matters, in adding value to the system? How do we measure a particular project to know if it's patient-centered? How do we know if our company warrants the label patient-centered or our initiative? And often somebody will raise their hand. Sometimes it's Sue Schrant, who I see standing over there, one of Joe's former colleagues, who says, why are we holding this particular element of R&D to a measurement standard that we don't put quality or we don't put physician expertise up to the same sort of barometer of whether it's working or not? Is it fair? Is it equitable to feel like we need a measuring tool for patient centricity and the value it adds, or should we just accept it on faith? What do you guys think?
Well, I think a measuring tool can be useful in that it can promote the change. I mean, I think patient centricity, Teresa alluded to this a little bit, and the need for culture change, I think of it as positively disruptive. Whether you're talking about patient centricity in more of a basic research context or patient centricity in FDA's decisions about what drugs to allow to go to market, those are very different contexts and there are very different elements involved. But both of them, they're really disrupting some traditional ideas about research, about drug approval, and so they require significant culture changes. And so I think one way is we could turn your question around and say, what is the value of developing metrics in this area? And would it help promote this and help institutions get more comfortable in this space if they can really see the value? Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of how I think of it more that way as to whether it needs to be.
It's a carrot, not a stick.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, put my funder hat on for a minute and just say that one of the key concerns of researchers, and I think it's very legitimate, is that engagement costs. And we actually say that you need to respect the patients, and the compensation for patients who are really working on the projects is an important part of it. No matter whether you are a funder of research or a researcher or a patient, you need to get an answer to this question, and that is going to require evaluation. We believe that patient engagement is going to do a lot of things to make research better. So, and one of the metrics I think that we've all pointed to is recruitment. If you've got more meaningful, more rational trials, and you've got patients participating in recruitment, you should see recruitment go up. It would be, you'd have to stop and re-examine what you're doing in the enthusiasm and maybe redirect those efforts a bit if some of these metrics don't change. So I think we do need to establish that it makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. So I was, to go back to something you said a minute ago, Joe, about the ideally, we would not have to, we would be able to pull from a repository or a library. I was thinking of good tools, and that they would fit the disease context that you're talking about. That to me, I mean, I was a little stumped at this question about overall metrics, but I think reducing the average cost of this kind of thing, I think, is something we're kind of thinking about longer term, how to make it sustainable. And talking with some of our EMA colleagues, I think they have a similar concern. They're a small agency. A lot of regulators are small. How do you sustain this engagement? You want to have it, but how do you do it? So I think we're looking at trying to, we'd like to see measures become more standardized. We'd like to see this become more of a standard part of doing business, if you will, but that if there is a good instrument out there that a company doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, about a third of our new drug approvals each year are from first-time filers. So a huge portion of new drugs come from innovative new companies that are probably going from one venture capital infusion to the next. And really, open-ended research in this patient area is just something they may not be able to entertain. And so what we're very concerned too is that we start to build repositories of good instruments so that when you go and you hear these symptoms that people care about, you can go see, well, is there a good instrument already out there for the kind of fatigue that is reported by people with multiple sclerosis? And so we're working on a repository. That'll be something that we'll develop. I know that patient-focused medicines development has tried to put together resources of FasterCures. So we probably want to have some coordination there, but hopefully people will have good publicly available pieces, reference tools that for some of this they won't have to go and do it again.
Laura, and I remember when we had our prep call to prepare for this conversation, you kind of put your hand up virtually and said, well, let's talk about patient outcomes and health being a measurement tool.
Absolutely, and you know, at the end of every day, I think that's what we're all here to do, right? Is to improve outcomes and improve health for all. And so it's important, and we need to do that. I do think that healthcare has more patient-centricity in it, in the other aspects of healthcare than people realize. I mean, you know, the American Heart Association, we certainly have many quality improvement and accreditation and certification programs, and in all of those, we have patients at the table thinking about both the business and the science of what those measures and what that criteria should be. Different kind of measures, different kind of tools, but there's a kind of an evolution, if you will, or a coming together of patient centricity and patient engagement and really user experience. And the healthcare system, I mean, when you look at new hospitals being built, they are all about user experience and getting patient input and caregiver input and family input. And so I think there's this convergence slowly coming together. Now, very different products, right? You know, healthcare is still not a consumer product. And so we need to think about that, and we do every day with our advocates and with our patients and all of our communities. So it's a great place to be.
It may help to break it down a little bit, because I think for the regulatory aspects, the benefit risk assessment, how do you put patient-reported outcomes into that, et cetera. I mean, my feeling is that's probably where we're going to see the tools first. You know, there's a lot of research going on already. It's semi-quantifiable, and it's going to come. But then there's the other question of engagement, and how do you have an organization like the size of Pfizer or the size of the FDA and make the whole organization patient-centric and patient-focused? And that's just incredibly hard to measure, because it's not only the output that's hard to measure. What are you going to get at the end? It's also the input, right? So, for example, we mandate all of our development folks to make sure that before approve a protocol, that they seek patient input into the protocol design, right? That's a quantitative measurement. Do that, right? Well, I recently met with an advocate, and she came to me and said, well, recently somebody visited me from your team, and they asked about input. I said, that's great. That's what we want to see. And then, it became clear that, yes, but the protocol was more or less finished, and it was just a check-the-box exercise, and she wanted to make sure that for management, she showed that, right? That's not what we want. So the challenge to me is actually not only measurement, but how do you create the culture? How do you make sure patients touch you along the entire value chain? Because once you bring them in, once you talk to them, it changes everybody. Right?
So I'm thinking about all of the folks here in the room, and each of them has an opportunity to participate in this culture change, in this movement, in advancing this aspiration to application. Give us some tips for people that they could take back to their workplaces tomorrow and start implementing in the work that they do.
Well, I'm happy to start. Tell stories. Market. It's marketing, right? This is part of it is marketing 101 to all those folks to convince them, why are we doing this? Why am I not just checking the box? And we have a lot of organizations that come to us and ask, now, why should we be doing this? And can you help us with this? And the publication that, Kim, I believe you have a copy in your hand, it's exciting to see successes published, and it's exciting to see these stories because the influencers in any organization, in any kind of company, want to know why. And once they hear it and they experience it, they just don't know what they don't know. And so if they've never seen the power that patient-centricity can bring to a situation and an outcome and the health of everyone, they're not going to, it's not even top of mind. So I would say tell a story, find a success, tell a story, and get it out there.
Great, perfect. Michael.
Well, I think the patient advocacy groups have an enormous role to play here. And what I would like to see is, hold the pharmaceutical company accountable, right? Don't just come to every meeting and.
We're happy to hold you accountable.
Exactly. No, but demand that there is not only dialogue, but there is action based on those dialogue, right? Not just have lots of meetings. Ask us. So okay, you met with us 3 times. Now we told you everything. What have you changed? Right? I think that will start driving behavior.
Well, I guess I'm not sure, depending on where you work, right? So if you're an innovator, if you're a sponsor, or you hope to be a sponsor of an application, or you're developing a medical product, then I think for you, it's the way to start is look at your programs, look at your portfolio, and are you asking those questions pretty early? You probably have a target area that you're thinking of. Have you done more than just a convenience focus group in one of the nice suburbs of Boston to try to figure out what people who have the disease think? Because the people who are convenient to your headquarters may not be the people who would be taking the drug. So basically, start asking very early and find out if, in fact, what they think about whatever they're taking today, what they think about the disease, how is it to live with that disease, how are you going to capture that? Is what you're developing going to respond to anything that you just heard? And start to think about that. If you're a venture capitalist, I'd say when you're meeting with your the companies that you're supporting, ask them about their plan to integrate the patient perspective, and because FDA is going to probably start asking about this pretty soon. So maybe you want to kind of get ahead there and start thinking about how you want to have the companies that you're investing in developing patient-centered products and have development programs that are capturing that. How are they integrating this kind of thinking into planning clinical trials? Find out what people like and don't like about trials. A lot of times, if it's too far away from where they live, or they're not going to, or they or their child are not going to be in your trial. If there's a lot of invasive procedures, talk to them about what's involved. Not just the consent form is very important, but the logistics and everything else. We've heard a lot from people, from patients,
yes,
about your enrollment rate will improve. You'll have less missing data. You will have better evidence. So, along the way, you can think about it. It's a good investment of time before you start the trial, okay? Obviously, good to think of these things early. So that's depending on your perspective. And I think the patient advocacy groups are already covered here. They know what they're doing, but I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. Joe?
Well, I think one thing I would add, and we see this a lot in PCORNet, that PCORNet is a national clinical research network with a lot of patient engagement and at all the sites. Not so much clinician engagement. So I think I would just like to say that our impression is that it is much more difficult to engage frontline clinicians than it is patients. Patients are naturally motivated. Frontline clinicians are not so much. But they really, when you can get them involved, it makes for really very rich exchanges, and I think much better chance that you'll come out with the right research question and get a study that's going to change practice.
Teresa brought up the interesting concept of representativeness and learning not just from convenient samples or the kind of the middle of the road, but in user-centered design, the tails are important too. And systems like PecorNet have the opportunity to help us understand that, and you've seen that too.
Yeah.
How about some advice?
Yeah, I was actually going to say that I agree that stories are so key, but not just obviously the success stories are really key for promoting this idea that patients really are drivers of creating a learning health system and really need to be at the center. But also the stories that point out the pain points and the challenges, because I think that this is exactly the right community. We really need to all be rolling up our sleeves and working together to address those big challenges. And just to give one example, probably the thing that's holding back the metastatic breast cancer the most right now, and that's the real limiting factor, it's not the patients and it's not enrollment, it's dealing with their medical records. We are still receiving their medical records primarily by fax. Wow. Maybe we get a PDF. None of it's not structured, it's not anything that we can easily deal with. Somebody has to take hours and hours to go through the entire hundreds of pages, thousands of pages, whatever it is, of that record and pull out the bits of information, and it may not be all that accurate. Also, there are issues around quality. So this is just unacceptable. And we should all be able to agree that this is unacceptable. It's a huge challenge. I'm not saying there's an easy solution, but this is the community that needs to, work to address that huge problem. There are other policy issues, but that's a big one.
That's a big one, and you were at OSTP taking on that big challenge in a different part of your career. And I know that we've got a workshop actually in this next segment of the meeting coming up where John Wilbanks and a team of other experts are going to talk about this scruffy data that's coming in and how we make use of it. We've also got the involution design team upstairs collecting people's thoughts on health data, and we hope you'll give us some of your input and insights into that topic. This has been a great conversation. I feel like we've moved the ball over these last 5 years, and it's a different conversation than we were having when it was all sort of, I can't remember who's, I think it's Ann Beal who said, this was, like a religious movement at one point, and we were all going on faith, and we didn't have many stakes to put in the ground yet, but we do now, and it's exciting to hear from all of you about the work you're doing to help really start to map this out in a way that can be reproducible, that can be reliable, that can be sustainable in all of the ways that we'll have to do that in order to make it ultimately successful. So thank you all for the work you do every day, for helping with this movement and making it, a revolutionary time, and with a lot of optimism about the promise it will deliver to the system. So please join me in thanking the panel. We've got two options for you. Lisa had sort of previewed those for you. We've got the Scruffy Data Workshop in Cityside 1, and I'm obstructed in my view by what's going on in the other room, but I think it's Partnering for Productivity. And then we're back here for lunch. You'll get your lunch upstairs and come back to the tables, and we'll have a plenary panel on Partnering for Productivity. That's a lot of P's. But thank you all, and we'll see you back in here in just a little while.